but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you.
Hi, and welcome along to Steve Wraith's True Crime Podcast. And it is good morning to our viewers in the USA and good evening to our viewers in the UK and everybody else around the world who is tuned in. And a big welcome to David Bunds. How are you, David?
Hello. Yes, I'm doing well.
Great. And we've had a great chat before coming on air. And I think a lot of people will be saying, well, why is Steve Wraith, a kid, a lad in the UK, interested in the WACO story? Well, just to give a little brief outline from my perspective, I was 21 when the tragedy unfolded on the news stations in the UK about what had happened in WACO. I followed the full 51 days, and I was shocked to what I was seeing, as I think millions of people around the world would have been. And gradually over the years, I've watched documentaries, I have read books, and like every human being, I have made up my own mind about what I feel about that situation and the over excessiveness of the law enforcement throughout that whole procedure. And for me personally, before we get into the chat with David, I just would like to pay my respect personally, and I've done this before on the Zoom calls with people who've survived this tragedy. I'd just like to pay my respects to those who didn't make it, because this isn't about glorification, glamorization. This isn't about hits. This isn't about trying to make money out of somebody else's tragedy. This is about a discussion with somebody who is an expert on the situation and has got the respect of many of the survivors. And I just wanted to push that out before we started this. This isn't anything other than a chat. And I'm certainly on the side of the Davidians and those who lost their lives and those who survived. So hope that clears it up from everyone's point of view before we get into it. But David, great to see you. Amazing story that you have personally, and I just want to plug the book, which I know you have helped supply a lot of information for. Koresh, True Story of David Koresh and the Tragedy at WACO by Stephen Talty. Sorry, and for me, I haven't read that one yet. It is on my list, my Amazon list, so I will get that book. But take us back to the beginning, David. Tell us a little background about how you became involved with the Branch Davidians.
So I was my father had been involved with them when he was about 29 years old. So he ran into a Branch Davidian and read a tract, and it resonated with him. So he joined up. So this was 1960. I was not born yet, but then he went through some stuff. 10 years later, we're living in Southern California, and I'm 5 years old, and my mother and father own a house, and everything's going great. And he feels guilty because he's left his faith, and so he rejoins the Branch Davidians. He goes to New Mount Carmel. That's the same place where the fire occurred in 1970. And then we all go at some point. He goes first, he comes back, we all go and we join up. And I remember being a 5-year-old child and being there and seeing Benjamin Roden, the founding prophet, and got to see cows and chickens. And it was because it's farmland and they had some farm animals there, and I had a lot of fun because I was a city boy and never seen a farm before. And then raised a Branch Davidian from that age for the next 14 years until I met David Koresh, who was Vernon Howell. So pre Vernon Howell, so pre 1981 is when he first showed up. It was just the original Branch Davidian prophets. So that would be Benjamin Roden, and then Lois Roden, his wife. And then when Benjamin Roden died, she took over. And she was the prophet when David Koresh showed up as a member, a new member of the church. So in the 1970s, I was living a fairly normal life. You know, I went to school, and a public school, and then would attend meetings that were held occasionally. And so we would have what was called a study, which was somebody sitting there and reading maybe from a tract and leading us through the points being made in a Branch Davidian literature about whatever. And for a child, that's very boring. You know, the meetings were about 2 hours roughly, which is exhausting for a small child. And then we did eventually move to Texas, actually. So when I was older, like starting from 1981, we would actually go down to Mount Carmel. So I was 16, and I would go and sit and listen to Lois Roden give a study. And yeah, and then eventually David Koresh showed up, and I saw him. I knew him. When I say I knew him, it doesn't mean that I knew him very well, but I was familiar with him. I saw him around. He would sit in the meetings. I do remember one instance where we were very, in terms of our emotional involvement in the meetings, I think you might be familiar with the standard Protestant reserved attitude in a religious service. Okay, we're not Pentecostal. Okay, so we're not making a lot of noise or anything. So David Koresh gets up in the meeting, Vernon Howell at the time, and he stands up and he starts crying, and he's sobbing because he says he's such a sinner, and this was unusual. Okay, I'm 16. I'm like, I don't know what to make of that, right? Like, that's weird. My father later on commented his disapproval, and he said, well, that guy sounds like he's going to have a message of his own one day, which turned out to be true. So
what did you what was your feeling as a young man? Were you religious? Did you feel that you had to be religious with your parental upbringing? Because for me personally, as a youngster, I was sent to Sunday school, and you either like it or you don't. I wasn't. And it's a bit different in the UK than maybe it is in the US. I'm not sure, but did you feel you had to be religious?
Yeah, my father was. I would never describe my father as religious. Okay. And the reason why I wouldn't is because when I think of somebody being religious, I think of somebody praying on the rosary, or staying up late at night doing Bible study, or praying a lot. Or even in the United States, we have evangelicals who want to pray in school, and they want to have the Bible in school, and they're always talking about God. And so we weren't like that in my home. I would more describe my father as superstitious. Yeah. So for example, when I was growing up, we didn't lock our house. And one day I think I asked, and my dad was like, well, don't talk about it because God is protecting our house. But if you talk about it, then God, so in other words, you'll jinx it. But he didn't say it that way. He said, well, you don't talk about it because you'll be presuming on God's protection. And then he'll be like, oh, okay, well, now I'm not going to protect your house anymore. And then what's really funny is one time his father visited, and we walk out the back door, and his father, my grandfather, says, hey, he asked me, how come we didn't lock the house? And so I'm between a rock and a hard place, right? My father's literally looking at me, giving me the evil eye. Don't you talk about it, but I've been told to respect my elders. So my grandfather's asked me a question I have to answer. I don't know what happened, but that was so my father was weird with his beliefs, and they were inconsistent. And that came to his beliefs in the Branch Davidian faith as well, because he claimed to be a Branch Davidian, but he wasn't supposed to smoke, and he smoked, and he wasn't supposed to eat meat, but we ate chicken. And so there was a bit of a 1 foot in, 1 foot out kind of thing. He wasn't supposed to watch TV on the Sabbath day, which he did that. I couldn't watch my Saturday morning cartoon. That's a thing here in the United States. When I was a kid in the 70s, I missed out on all those cartoons, but he got to watch his John Wayne movies. So yeah, my father was inconsistent. So anyway, by the time I was 17, the thing that happened was actually my father basically kind of left the group. He didn't say as much, but he, by his actions, I could see, because I'm 17. I'm not, I'm transitioning into being able to analyze my father. Like, this guy's not all the way, not with it all the way. So for me, he was an apostate. I was like, oh, my father is falling away from the faith because he's got me. I've been converted. I'm like, hey, this is the truth. But see, I can't confront my father because he's one of those type A personalities. He's very angry. So you're not going to mess with him. But then by the time I met up with Koresh, that's what primed me, is because I had been asking questions. So when I met with him for the first time in 1984, I was still in high school.
Take me through that meeting. What was it like meeting David Koresh? What kind of person?
So what happened was he had been sending letters from the headquarters at Mount Carmel. So he had been teaching at Mount Carmel for about 6 months, roughly. But he was just teaching the group that was there at the property, which was just a small group of people. And the Branch Davidians had perhaps maybe 50 people out scattered around the United States who they were referred to as in the field, as opposed at the headquarters. So we got some letters, and I couldn't make much of them at the time. They would kind of seem cryptic to me. I remember seeing them. But then we got a call from a longtime Branch Davidian. His name was Perry Jones, and he was the father of David Koresh's first wife, Rachel. And he called my father and was asking, well, what did you think of the letters? And my father hadn't seen them. I handed my father the letter. Oh, yeah, I don't know what to think of it. And so Perry Jones informed him that, oh, well, there's a new message that's come to the Branch Davidians, and you need to listen to it. You need to read and study. And my father wasn't very excited about that. Now that's Perry Jones. Yeah, my father began to study it, but then Vernon Howell at the time showed up in Southern California, and he asked for a meeting with our family. So that would be with my father and my mother and my sister and me. I was the only one willing to go. The other members of my family at the time were not interested. So I rode my bicycle down to a local park, and I met with Perry Jones and Vernon Howell, and we had a study. And he was very, so the thing that he had was to be able to look you in the eye and just be 100% confident, to project confidence. And I was 18, so also I'm kind of naive, because if someone looks me in the eye and they're confident and they act and they project 100% confidence in what they're saying, then my personality is, wow, they must know what they're talking about. It seems very naive to me now, but that's the way I thought back then. So it was about a 3 or 4 hour meeting. I remember that it went into the evening, and after being gone so long, my parents were worried about me, because from their point of view, he might have been some kind of psycho or something. Maybe they've murdered David, and maybe he's been murdered and dumped in a garbage bin or something, But I did show up back home, and then we got into an argument with my father. Well, my father's like, well, you can't make a decision like that so quickly, which he was right. But the thing is he had no credibility with me, because he was an apostate. He had left the faith. So I was like, well, you don't know. I was thinking in my mind, you don't know what you're talking about, old man. You abandoned your own faith. So that was the problem. If he had been maybe more genuine towards his own beliefs, and maybe I ought to listen to him. But anyway, we all ultimately did go to Mount Carmel in 1984 for Passover season. What was that like? So that was the big meeting, the last unified meeting of all the Branch Davidians from around the country before the movement essentially splintered off into multiple sects. In other words, it disintegrated. And So it was very interesting in terms of seeing all the different Branch Davidians there. George Roden, of course, was there. He was Lois Roden's son. And obviously David Koresh at the time, Vernon Howell was there with Rachel, and he was married to Rachel, and little Cyrus there hadn't been born yet. He was born in the next year. But so there was a lot of confrontations between various individuals. Charles Pace was there. Now, Charles Pace is the one that's the last man standing, so to speak. He's at the property right now in possession of it, because after the ATF and FBI left, and he was the one that ended up showing up there and becoming in possession of the property. So Charles Pace was there, and there's all this arguing going on and disputation about the future of the Branch Davidians. Lois Roden was there, of course, but she was traumatized. And the reason why she was is because she had been involved with an affair with Vernon.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I know this is because she actually said in a meeting, she confessed to it. She stood up and said in everyone's hearing that myself, Lois, and Vernon here have had an affair. And I wanted to tell everyone to be truthful with everyone so that you knew that that's what happened. And Vernon is sitting giving a study, and he's just he's got his hands buried in his face, and he's just, oh, Lois, Sister Roden, what are you doing? Because he always liked to be very secretive about it, kind of mysterious. And so this was a bit shocking to a lot of the people in the group. So I remember one woman was shaking. You never saw her again. I stuck around, but I was 19, kind of naive. So yeah. So it was the result of that meeting in 1984 kind of split everyone off into different directions. So George Roden had his group, Charles Pace had his group. George went off to take possession of the property after his mother died in 1986. Vernon himself had to leave the property because he felt that his life was in danger, which it might have been because George was really angry and George had a gun. And so Vernon Howell, of his own free will, got into a car with one of the Branch Davidian members, Raymond Friesen. He's one of the ones that actually died in the fire. And they drove out of the entrance, and David Koresh didn't return back to Mount Carmel for 4 years.
Where did he go?
We ultimately ended up at a house in the city of Waco proper, since Mount Carmel is actually outside the city limits. And we stayed in this house from 1984 to 1985. And it was a house that we were given use of by a friend of Lois Roden's. And so that was kind of his headquarters for about a year while he figured out what to do. And then eventually we end up in another city in East Texas, which was fittingly called Palestine. That's the actual name of the city. And we ended up in a piece of property north of there as well, kind of our exiled headquarters for a number of years, while David Koresh plotted on how to get Mount Carmel back. So,
and he plotted to get it back, and that, I think that's the first, for me as an observer and someone who's watched documentaries, that seemed to be a big turning point for me, because clearly unhappy about losing out.
Oh yeah. Well, the thing that surprised me is he would say that he didn't care. Like he called it a bowl of beans. So if you know the Bible, a bowl of beans is the story of Jacob and Esau in the Old Testament. Jacob is the second born, and he doesn't have the birthright. So he makes a deal with his brother. Hey, I'll give you a bowl of my lentil stew for your birthright. And Esau's so hungry, like, oh yeah, whatever, I don't care. And that's called Esau's porridge, the lentil stew now. And that's what Vernon called Mount Carmel at one point. A bowl of let George have the bowl of beans, George Roden. But apparently he really did actually want it back pretty badly, because as you know, there was a confrontation in 1987, which ended up going to trial because a group of David Koresh and his followers were on the property trying to get pictures of a coffin, because George had dug it up, because George, unfortunately, I think was a little mentally unstable.
Yeah.
So consequently, he challenged David Koresh to a resurrection contest, and it was a declined. But then the idea came, hey, maybe we can get him convicted on corpse abuse. So if we could get pictures. And so they ended up on the property snooping around, but oops, George saw them, and then there's a gun battle, and then the sheriff's called and ends up going to jail, and then there's a trial. But then the trial, they win, they're acquitted. And then George Roden, unfortunately, his mother has passed away at this point, so it's just him at the property now. And I think he was very alone. He had alienated a lot of people because of his eccentric behavior. And then not only that, but he also managed to get the judge mad at him, and he was put in jail for contempt of court. And so this meant that Mount Carmel was essentially unoccupied by anybody who had any authority. There were some people there, but David Koresh made his move in a triumphant return at Passover 1988. After a 4-year exile, he's back. And they all just move on to the property, and anybody who was there just split really quickly, because they don't, And that's when all of the followers ended up setting up camp back at Mount Carmel. And then I showed up back there by summer of '88. I was there as well. I had been in exile in Houston, Texas for a while because I had tried to leave once and failed. So I ended up back there for one last 10 months of hell before I finally got kicked out.
And the story for Roden doesn't end well either, does it? Because he ended up
right. He ended up murdering someone, but not guilty by reason of insanity, I think it was. So was institutionalized. And in 1998, he passed away. Had a heart attack, I think, after an escape attempt at the age of 60. Yeah, it's very tragic.
Yeah, no, certainly was.
Yeah.
So with Mount Carmel now under the the leadership, if you like, of Vernon Howell, who was later to become David Koresh.
Yeah, about 1990 is when he changed his name. But in
'89, he released the New Light audio tape, didn't he?
Right. So the tape is a recording of, we called it the Scream tape. That's the kind of like the name we came up with just to refer to it. But it was officially a tape to the Australians. So when the New Light began to be taught in August of 1989, this was something that he had been working up to probably for several months, because it's quite shocking. Because the shocking thing about the New Light is that in addition to the women that are already his wives, and we could back up a little bit and just briefly say that in 1986, David Koresh began to teach polygamy. So for the past 3 years, from 1986 to 1989, he's polygamous. And so he has a number of wives at this point in 1989. But in 1989, he then begins to teach that, hey, actually, God has shown me that all of the marriages in the group are nullified. It wasn't even a matter of divorce. It was a matter of my New Light teaches that actually all of these marriages are nullified. You never were really married, kind of like a marriage nullification doctrine from the Catholic Church. He hands everybody a nullification notification of their marriage, and then, well, that means all the women are mine now. And so he never said that he took anybody's wife, because he according to him, he didn't. It was that's a key point, because he's even on the tape saying, well, people saying I'm taking men's wives, and that's crazy. I never taught that. So they're confused. And then he goes on to say that means they're Babylonians, and then that means they're going to, die, and I'm going to kill them, and just everything goes to hell, right? So, yeah, a lot of nerve. He takes your wife, and then he tells you he's going to kill you. I mean, whatever, but that's the way he was. So that tape was sent to Australia to try to get the Australian contingent, which they had trouble staying in the United States because they were only on visas. So they'd have to go back. And at this particular point, when the new light came, most of the Australians were back home. And Mark Bro, who we haven't mentioned yet. So Mark Bro was a follower of David Koresh who came into the group in 1986. And he was a student at Loma Linda University. And he actually ran into Perry Jones at a grocery store, just a chance meeting. And pretty soon, Mark Bro is in the group and becomes kind of the second in command, sort of, theologically anyway. He's kind of has his own little side thing going on with a message from God in terms of being like a minor prophet, I suppose, to David Koresh's major prophethood. But by 1989, Mark Bro's having trouble with this new light. And he had married an Australian national, Elizabeth. So he went back home to Australia in 1989 and he spilled the beans. And Koresh sends them a tape to try to get them back in line. And so that's why we have that tape today, which basically lays out more or less what the new light is. And one of the features of the new light is that he's the Lamb of God in Revelation. And that figure in Revelation, that creature, has ultimate authority and can open the book and reveal all the seals and has all of the keys, and everything is basically that you can't go any higher than that. That's as he said, it's the most powerful of all the prophets in the Bible.
Fascinating. So moving forward to 1990, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, he decides to change his name. Why does he do that?
Well, so there's a scripture in Isaiah that is talking about Cyrus. And so Cyrus historically is an ancient king of Persia, but the Hebrew pronunciation is Koresh. And this is important. The King James has the language of I have surnamed thee. So the surname is a key thing there. So the surname, according to Vernon Howell, is Koresh. The surname is Koresh. Mm-hmm. And then the name is David, because that's the Messiah. That's a messianic name, David, the latter day David. There's prophecies in the Bible about a future David. And so you put the two together, right? You got a first and a last name. That's how he gets his name. And he assumes that name in 1990 legally. And his father, by the way, would be Yahweh Koresh. So God has a first and last name as well. So yeah, Yahweh Koresh and his son David Koresh. He actually signed letters that were sent to the FBI from Mount Carmel during the siege. They're signed Yahweh Koresh because they're letters from God, so to speak. I don't know if you knew that, but yeah.
No, I didn't know.
Yeah, they're actually. I've seen pictures of them. So literally in Hebrew at the bottom, Yahweh Koresh. Mm-hmm. And the letters are speaking as if God is talking. You've angered me and you've dare speak against my son, and I'm going to destroy the dam at Lake Waco, because that's a local feature. The dam is holding back the waters of Lake Waco, and so as a punishment, God's going to break the dam, which is a prophecy that hasn't been fulfilled yet. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So things now start to take a turn for the worst, and I think really, you know, watching the documentaries, reading the books that I have done, it's a gradual decline, isn't it? And you know, from the perspective of the people, I guess, living in Mount Carmel, things are fine, but it's the outside, isn't it? And you know, if we fast forward a few years later, and we take the story to the 27th of February 1993, a newspaper article
Right.
was you know, basically what lit the blue touch paper in the WACO Tribune Herald.
Yes.
The headline was simply "The Sinful Messiah," wasn't it?
Yes, which really isn't wrong. That Koresh did teach he was a sinful Messiah, so not a crazy title. It sounds bad, but that was one of his teachings, that he taught that, well, unlike Jesus, who was theoretically would be sinless, he himself as a Messiah would be one step closer to humanity, because he would experience sin. And so therefore, by virtue of experiencing sin, he would be able to better sympathize and judge humanity. Yes. So that series of articles in the Waco Tribune Herald began to release just prior to the raid by the ATF. And I had actually been in contact with the reporters who put those articles together, and I had provided them with some information. So that was ultimately going to be a 7-part series. And then as soon as the raid happened, I think they just released all the rest of the series very quickly in a special edition.
Just to give the viewers an idea of this was the opening passage. If you are a Branch Davidian, Christ lives on a threadbare piece of land 10 miles east of here called Mount Carmel. He has dimples, claims a 9th grade education, married his legal wife when she was 14, enjoys a beer now and then, plays a mean guitar, reportedly packs a 9mm Glock, and keeps an arsenal of military assault rifles, and willingly admits that he's a sinner without equal.
Yeah, that's essentially true. That's an accurate description.
And that really was the beginning of, you know, everybody else's trouble at Mount Carmel, because this, as you rightly point out, then leads to the ATF. And to those of you in the UK who don't know what the ATF is, it's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, the Sheriff's Department. And
a strange combination of things. But yeah, I guess there's a historical reason. Sure. And those are the things that they're in charge of.
Exactly. And the reason, and their reason for coming to Mount Carmel was what?
Okay, so from my understanding, there actually had been a tip from the local law enforcement because of unusual shipments going to New Mount Carmel that got attention. So these would be shipments that could be possibly used to manufacture, or at least convert semi-automatic weapons to fully automatic. And I have to remember, I wasn't there, but my father was there, and he did tell me in confidence in the subsequent years that it was an activity that they were trying to do. They were trying to take semi-automatic weapons and turn them into fully automatic. He said that it was very difficult, labor-intensive work, and that they had not really done an enormous amount of that work. So my interpretation is, how much did they actually convert? I have no idea. There was some, not all. But the answer to the question is the ATF was notified of a possibility of perhaps illegal weapons conversions happening. And so they began an investigation, and they found evidence that it's possible, you know, there was illegal weapons going on there. So then it ultimately ended up in getting a warrant. So then the question is as you know, the execution of the warrant was very aggressive. Yeah. So that was the methodology they came up with to turn it into a massive operation. That was because I think of this incredible fear because of all the weaponry that was there. And we know there were a lot of weapons there because they were in the subsequent forensic analysis after the fire. I think you can look it up. There's umpteen many rifles and so much ammunition and whatever. So, I mean, I'm just trying to be a neutral observer at this point, and then speculating that maybe the ATF was afraid of all those weapons, and that's why they decided to go in hard. You know, whether that was a good decision, it seems like maybe it wasn't.
It clearly wasn't from my perspective. I mean, as a young man in England watching this over-aggressive, ATF raid on what essentially was a compound full of women and children. A lot of there were men in there who, again, yes, there were weapons.
There was a report issued, which is online if you wanted to read it. I've been through it, and basically one of the criticisms was that not all options were exhausted prior to the raid. They had not properly gone through all of the different things that you could do in terms of perhaps executing a warrant without resorting to such aggressive tactics. Yeah, that was the finding, the government finding. So even the government is acknowledging that more peaceful methods could have been tried first.
I saw one report which claimed that the ATF were saying that there was a meth lab, and that Quresh was trying to establish drugs. I'm sure this was one of those stories which was thrown out at the end to justify.
Let me tell you about the meth lab. There was a meth lab, but the meth lab was on the property during George Roden's control. Okay. So George Roden is, you think about George Roden. He's there. So let's talk a little bit about George Roden.
Okay.
George Roden, when his father died, he was actually in exile by his father. You have to know that his father was the only person in the entire world that could control George. That's it. So because George was a troublemaker, there's a biography written by Carolyn Wessinger. She's an academic, and she wrote a biography about Clive Doyle. So it's Clive Doyle's story. And Clive Doyle in this book talks about George in the old days, back in the 60s, and what a hothead he was. So if anybody's interested in reading some firsthand information about George Roden and what kind of person he was, you can look up that book about Clive Doyle. Carolyn Wessinger, I think, is the author. Anyway, so George was a troublemaker. His father sent him to California on a border community, which is in the desert, in a trailer park, to keep him at arm's length and under control so that he wouldn't be at Mount Carmel causing trouble. But when his father died, he came back to Mount Carmel and tried to assume the leadership of the branch. And he ended up fighting with his mother. Went to court. Long story short, there you go. There's information about George in there if anybody. Plus, it's a good book if you want to learn something about Clive's own history. He was an Australian. Okay, so George Roden and Lois Roden get into a bitter power struggle in 1979. There's a court case. George is removed from Mount Carmel by court order. During the time that David Koresh was a underling, that is, he shows up and he just becomes a student of Lois Roden, George Roden returns back. Lois Roden allows him to come back and move back onto the property. And he stayed there at the property from approximately 82, I suppose, to all the way to 1988, when he was removed because of his trouble with the judge and becoming contempt of court. During that time, Lois Roden, his mother, dies, and the funds coming into the branch movement are slowly dwindling, as you can imagine, as the organization disintegrates and falls apart. So George Roden begins to allow, let's say, undesirables to come move onto the property to supplement his income. And one of these undesirables would have been someone who was into meth production, apparently.
Right.
And that lab was found by David Koresh and his followers when they took possession of the property. And I think the authorities were notified properly, if I'm not mistaken. So the ATF shenanigans, pulling up a meth lab, I'm gonna call shenanigans on that. Yeah, I'm gonna call shenanigans on that one.
Yeah, and this
Yeah,
is the kind.
that's not fair.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that they put out there.
Yeah, that's shenanigans. That's basically trying to manipulate like judges to say, "Oh, judge, there's a meth lab out here, man. We got to do something about that."
And especially with the clamp down on drugs at the time.
Yeah, exactly. It's Texas.
Justification.
Yeah, we can't have drugs in Texas. This is Texas, man. Don't mess with Texas. That's one of the sayings that they have out there.
So the raid does take place, and
Yes.
as we've already said, February the 28th, 1993, they attempted to execute the search warrant, and it was a complete and utter
there had been
disaster.
There had been a fortuitous leak from the point of view of David Koresh, a fortuitous leak. Oh, in that picture there, you see all the go-karts against the wall there. Do you see them?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are interesting. I'll give you a little story about those. So that's for the men. And then I'll give you a story and I'll give you my interpretation. So they used to race those all around the property, David Koresh and the men, and have races. My father told me that they would let him win. I guess he didn't like to lose, My theory was this is to blow off steam. If you got a bunch of men who aren't allowed to, be married or have girlfriends, then there's a lot of pent up frustration probably. And what I'm saying is that when I was there, we weren't allowed to have go-karts because that would have been seen as a frivolity. But there had been a loosening up of restrictions apparently during the time I was gone, because now we can play go-karts, which is a lot of fun, I'm sure. But I wouldn't have been able to ever ride a go-kart when I was there. That would have been frowned upon. So apparently there's a change in the tone.
Yeah.
And I suspect it's because he has to keep people busy.
Yeah.
That's my theory. But anyway, so yeah, that was the ATF raid and the tip that David Koresh received from his brother-in-law, Rachel Koresh at this point, but her brother David Jones was a post worker. And he was driving in the area and happened to stop by some reporters who were lost. And hey, you know where this thing is, Mr. Postal Worker, where they're going to do a raid? Like, what? Runs back and tells David Koresh. So, oh my goodness, now they know. And then the ATF found out they knew because they had a mole, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know if you heard that story. There was an agent on the inside. He gets out of there really quick. And I think that David Koresh knew that he was an agent. Pretty sure. And goes back and informs his superiors, hey, we better call this thing off because, the whole plan is based on a surprise. But they did it anyway. That was one of the criticisms in the report I mentioned, was this pressure to keep going. It's like a freight train that just won't stop, like, gotta go. We got to keep going no matter what, which of course is silly. But that's what they did. So, yeah.
And in the ensuing gun battle, David Koresh is injured.
Yeah. The who shot first thing, my opinion is there were, before my understanding, there were dogs. Standard procedure was to shoot dogs down quickly because they could be potentially dangerous. And so when they shot the dogs, I mean, that's the first shots, in my opinion. Just makes sense to me. Once the shots start flying, it's just all hell breaks loose. Excuse me.
And I genuinely think as well, I mean, having read up on this and researched a lot of the stories, I think some of the evidence that disappeared, like the door, for instance, the front door.
Well, one of the things that they used to argue about a lot with the negotiator was according to the Branch Davidians, there had been gunshots fired into the roof, down into the roof of the building from helicopters, apparently, which there were helicopters there. But the problem is the negotiators who had not been involved in this operation must have been told, or at least they just assumed, that it's impossible that bullets were fired from the top of the building because it's not allowed. It's forbidden. And so therefore it couldn't have happened. Well, the people, I've read the transcripts, Sherry Jewell, for example, who's arguing with the negotiator, she's basically saying it's expletive, bull, hey, I saw the bullets, I saw the bullet holes, I know that it happened. And so the negotiator, I guess, because he's a government employee, he can't, what's he going to do? Agree with him? Oh, you're right, we did shoot bullets. Oh, well, I guess I'm going to have to go, he can't do that. He's just stuck. So he has to keep denying. But yet I do believe those accounts. I think that they had shot bullets. And the reason why I think that is because if you're in a chaotic situation where people are panicking, agents are not robots, they're just humans. If they started shooting because they felt like whatever, then anything can go wrong in a situation like that. I actually had a federal investigator come to my home in 1993, and he was doing a follow-up investigation into this tragedy, and he worked for the government, but he was very biased. I mean, he was on the side of the government from his attitude, and he was telling me about how disciplined agents are and how they count their bullets, 1, 2. And I remember thinking at the time, like, well, I mean, sure, they might be trained to count bullets, but what if they panic? What if they just, I mean, really, are they going to count their bullets? Is that what you're telling me? That everybody's counting their bullets, and when everybody's ready to get shot over this, obviously this gigantic mess that's happened with all these bullets flying everywhere. So yeah, I agree with you that there's definitely some shenanigans and cover-ups going on. Yeah, and embarrassments. I wouldn't necessarily chalk it up to conspiracy. I would chalk it up to incompetence and
a complete mismanagement,
incompetence, and then covering your butt in the aftermath to make sure you don't get in trouble and all that kind of stuff.
I completely agree. And, and again, I do believe I watched the documentary, The Rules of Engagement. And I think there was a sheriff on there who basically said that the ATF agents only withdrew when they were out of ammunition. So for me, it was just a mess of their own creating, and then it was about covering up after themselves. And the fact, tragedy for them, they lost 4 officers. And we should never forget that. There was also 16 injured. But there was also 5 Branch Davidians killed in the raid. So the losses taken on both sides, and horrendous that anybody should have died on what should have been a simple issuing of a warrant, and maybe things would have turned out differently, but it clearly wasn't meant to be. And this is where we now enter the standoff, which. I enter really as a viewer in the UK, as somebody who's left college and is doing his first job and getting up and having my breakfast in the morning, and suddenly I wake up to see this crazy standoff in America where you're then in the hands of the media, and I always find it fascinating because there's been many events over the course of time since then. Twin Towers, for example, in America, terrorist attacks in the UK, and you are left then in the hands of the media. And I often watch the different news channels. I'll spend half an hour watching one, half an hour watching another, and half an hour watching another. And you get a completely different story from each of these news agencies. And the public then get their idea of what's going on from the news that they're fed. And I had an open mind on this whole situation as a youngster. And I just generally felt that as a 21-year-old man at the time, I'm 51 now, that the authorities had got this all wrong. And yes, okay, this guy might not be, the person that he's, claiming to be. Maybe this guy should be taken into custody for questioning. But it was for me, it just seemed a complete mismanagement. And my biggest concern, as I sat in my home in the UK, and my parents' home at the time, and was the women and children in there. And that, to me, was a major, major concern. Especially children who don't have any option other than to do what they're told. And this siege went on not for a couple of days, but it went on for
50 days.
51 days, wasn't it?
51 days.
51 days. I mean, what did you think as you watched this unfold?
Well, when I saw tactics like playing loud music all night and animal slaughter noises, and the theory was, well, we're trying to break down their resolve, I was like, no, that's not going to work. It's very silly. It was very silly. The idea that the children were hostages, and if I remember correctly, the parents were holding the children up to the windows, which of course the parents are just simply showing the children, hey, look out there, see all those tanks and bad people out there that are trying to, persecute us. Oh yeah, I see, Daddy. That's what's going on. But the ATF or the FBI at this point is interpreting it as, oh, the kids are being held up to the windows to show us the children, to threaten us, saying, you better not come in here, we'll kill our kids. That's just a matter of interpretation, right? Which is obviously silly. Anybody just to think about it for 5 seconds, what's going on. So this narrative of hostages, which is why one of the reasons why they had the hostage rescue team on site, which is a special operation, right? So that's these guys trained, they're there, they are becoming fatigued, I suppose. That was the claim toward the end. We've got to do something because our hostage rescue team is getting tired and we have to hurry up and finish this up, So the whole approach to the entire thing was from a false narrative, right? We're not really dealing with a hostage situation here. We're dealing with a true believer situation. So these people, and then the negotiators had spoken to most of the people there on the phone. They even talked to little Cyrus. I've read some of that stuff. They talk to the different members, and just because they're trying to get a sense of, well, what's going on? Are these people really genuine believers? And as far as they could tell, they were. I agree with you. The children just have to do what they're told. They're children, but they're not being held in chains in a cage or anything. They're just kids. So the narrative is in reports that came out in the aftermath, there was even arguments within the FBI at the time. Behavioral specialists and psychologists are saying, hey, you're doing the thing that's Clive Doyle and Vernon Howell there. You're doing the thing that he expects you to do, right? You're playing into his hands, so to speak. Some were advocating, hey, why don't you just all pack up and leave? Yeah. Do the opposite of what he expects if you want to get anywhere with him. But that, like
and he wasn't in a position to stop people. I mean, he was nursing a pretty severe injury.
Yeah,
wasn't he?
I think. Yeah, but I mean, even though he was injured, I think he was still able to communicate effectively. But I think that I don't think there was anything preventing people from leaving.
And the negotiators had a degree of success because they were in communication with him.
Yeah.
They were speaking to him on numerous occasions. I mean, I've been very privileged in the fact that I was sent the FBI negotiation recordings, so I've listened to them all. And that at times you can almost feel the frustration of those people who built up the communication with him, because just when you think they've got round to persuading him, and they have people like Steve Schneider and that on the phone, who again seem to be very positive about potentially coming out and moving out, and we're going to come out, and it all eventually came round to David, and David
Well,
would always.
There was one case where they had arranged everything, and there was a recording played on a local radio station as a bargain. But when it came time to actually follow through, David Koresh did the old thing that he did occasionally. Oh, God just told me not to do it. That was the frustrating thing about dealing with him, was the voice of God that he would hear sometimes, right? And so it's kind of like a wild card, because they had, I remember very well, they had arranged to play a recording of David Koresh on a local radio station, and hey, we play that. Once it's done, then we fulfilled our end of the bargain. The people will start coming out. They had buses lined up, ready to go, and then nothing happened. And then eventually the word came out, oh, the deal is off because David Koresh said God told him not to. And I mean, that may very well be true or not true. That's a theological question, right? But from the FBI perspective, that's frustrating, as you just said. And from the negotiators' perspective, that's frustrating as well.
Do you think as well the fact that when some of the women and children did go out, as part of, David's, he allowed a few people to leave, that some, it was then leaked into the media that, the women and the children had been separated and the women were arrested. And that again, is going to cause a problem within.
Right. The optics of just putting people in cuffs and taking them away right there. I think that was probably the tension between the negotiators and the people on the actual premises. And like I mentioned earlier, because of the deaths of agents and the bad blood and the resentment and the anger, I think there's an extreme desire to exact revenge by the authorities that are there on site. So sure, let's slap these guys in handcuffs right away. These are horrible people. We certainly, so not a very good strategy from a negotiating point of view.
Another bad bit of strategy, let's put it that way. 14th of April, David Koresh sends a letter out via his lawyer. This ended up being his last communication with the outside world. And in this letter, he claimed that he was writing down his interpretation of the 7 seals of the Book of Revelation. And he promised then to exit the compound as soon as it was completed. And I think watching and listening to a lot of the agents, subsequently after the story develops, they'd lost all patience, and those above those agents, it was becoming a national embarrassment, wasn't it? And I just think this was the US government coming at the end of their tether.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about David Koresh writing down his message is that he never wrote down his message. That's the thing you have to understand. He had an oral message. So if he then is agreeing at this point to write it down, that's actually a big deal. I don't know if they understood that, because he never wrote anything down on purpose. He even told me one time on the phone, David, I have a spoken message. Lois Roden taught that the last message would be spoken. And so I think there was a scholar who came into this, James Tabor, and he apparently, from what I understand, was able to communicate to some degree. And so this triggered a desire in David Koresh to write his message down in a 7 seal, in 7 parts, 7 installments, so to speak. And that was the final deal. Supposedly he was in that process, but as you said, the FBI lost patience and didn't wait. Maybe they felt, well, he'll just pull the same thing and say God told him not to, or whatever. Who knows? We'll never know. So,
As you watched the incident on the 19th of April unfold, And I'm sure you've probably watched it back many times, like most people watching this will have, and I certainly have. What is your true feeling about what you saw happen? Because there'll always be that question mark over whether the assault that took place was what ultimately caused the carnage that we saw and the deaths that we saw, or was it something that was started from within? What's your honest opinion on that?
Well, I think so. I think there was a forensic analysis, so it comes down to the question of, do you believe that the conspiracy goes to the level of fabricating evidence and lying and all that? If you believe that, then I don't think that you would trust the government's analysis. So you might, because I think there are presentations out there, which I haven't seen a huge number of them, that are accusing the government of setting the fire intentionally. I'm not in that camp. I think that the fire most likely was set by David Koresh, or at least commanded to be set. Now, the reason why I think that, so one of the things is that since I knew David Koresh, I have an advantage over some people because most people didn't know him. So because I did know him, and I think about, apparently to me, what's happening is they had made a deal. David Koresh thought they had a deal, but then when the government started attacking the building with gas, and then at some point they're just, from what I could tell, they're just knocking the building down. They're pushing the building down with the tanks. From what I could tell, it looks like they just wanted to knock the whole thing down, right? So that there wasn't a building anymore.
There's the tank going in.
It seemed to me, yeah, the tanks, because the gas wasn't working. So then they just started becoming frustrated because, again, this is a thing where, like you said, they're trying to save face. They're trying to wrap this up. The gas didn't work. So now let's just knock the building down. So anyway, David Koresh gets mad. He gets angry. So he's lost control of the situation because they're knocking the building down. He's like, well, I'm going to take control back. He starts the fire. And fire was part of his theology anyway. So him starting fires is not, to me, not crazy. It's something that I think he might do. It wouldn't have been something that he would have thought was like impossible or wrong or anything. It was like, well, yeah, let's just, because they thought they were coming back anyway. They were going to be resurrected. So I don't see it as crazy that he started a fire.
No. And yeah, I mean, again, watching the fire develop at such a quick pace and looking, again, camera angles can be deceiving, but looking at where the camera angles start.
But I will allow, since again, I could be wrong, maybe it was an accidental. I don't know. Ultimately, I just suspect that perhaps they set the fire, but I certainly won't say that I definitively have all the answers. I'm not sure, but yeah, I think that's likely.
Yeah, it's just an opinion.
Yeah.
Correct us if I'm wrong. I think it was 76 people who passed away.
Yeah, total. I think it was more like 80 total between the ones that died initially and the ones that died in the fire. From what I've seen, it's about 80 individuals total. From excluding the agents themselves. So that would have been like 84 total between agents and members.
Tragic loss of life, and those who did survive, those who were released early, and those who managed to escape the fire were arrested and put on trial.
Let's see. I think some of them made deals. Some of them, most of them were, I think some of them were acquitted. A lot of them served sentences. Yeah,
including one guy who I've subsequently got to know and meet in the UK, Livingston Fagan.
Yes.
Again, something which I found fascinating as I studied the story of the Branch Davidians and the case of WACO was that there were a lot of British people who had travelled to WACO to live on the compound, who had met David Koresh while he was on a whistle-stop tour of the UK?
Yeah, I think a lot of them were associated with the Newbold College, which is a Seventh-day Adventist institution of education. And then I didn't meet most of these people because they came in after I had left. But yeah, there was a proportionally speaking, there was a very large contingent of members of the UK, citizens of the UK
33 in total. 33
right.
in total.
It's quite substantial proportionally to the total membership of the group. Yeah.
Amazing. And of the 33, sadly, 24 of them passed away.
Yeah.
I've got to be honest. I look at this whole case, and you know, it's one that it does fill me with intrigue, but also fills us with dismay. There are numerous groups on Facebook where we have, you know, I'm, you know, proud to say I'm, you know, been on those groups for quite a while now, and I do, you know, watch with interest, and you know, a lot of the survivors will share things, etc. on there. Is the belief still from some of those people, do you think, that there could be you know, David could come back? I know I've spoken to, you know, to one person in particular. I'm not going to name that person, but they still believe that there will be a day where David returns.
Right. I mean, since David Koresh was very much about fulfillment of biblical prophecy, then from the point of view of a believer, since the prophecies haven't been fulfilled yet, then he would have to come back and fulfill them. That would make sense to a believer, sure. And I know that Clive Doyle, who recently passed away last year, he actually was a participant in a documentary called Waiting for David, which I participated in. I don't know if that's available publicly, but it was a couple of Swedish women who produced that documentary, and they follow Clive around and get his story. And so, yeah, that's what Clive was waiting for. It was David Koresh to return. And unfortunately, Clive, you know, ran out of time. But yeah, you're right. There are other individuals who are still waiting and hoping that it.
What's your belief?
Oh, I don't I don't believe that David Koresh was a true prophet. Yeah, I would put him in the category of false prophet. But that would be just because I've analyzed his teachings and found them to be not biblical. So, I mean, that's pretty straightforward for me. That was my problem from way back in 1990. I left the group because of that. Or he was asking me to come back, and I wouldn't come back because I disagreed with him about his teachings.
Well, do you think the reason that he tried to persuade you to go back was because he worried about the message that you might convey to other people about what he was doing there?
I think he wanted me to come back because from his perspective, he was probably concerned about me. I mean, you know, I'm not saying that he was an intentionally evil person or deceptive that way. I think that he was a true believer. So as a true believer, right? Because look at it this way, right? We know that there are religious con men. So you know the type.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I don't think that David Koresh was like that. I think that he was genuinely sincere in his beliefs. I think that he really did believe he was a prophet and a messenger of God and ultimately a Messiah. And so from that perspective, he has concern for anybody who would accept his message and be saved. So he felt the same about me, I'm sure. But of course, the flip side would be if you are an enemy, right, then he has to pass judgment. So he would speak in very dark terms about those who rejected him. So, yeah.
What have you made of the documentaries and the dramatizations that have been made about WACO?
There is the one series recently came out. I watched the first episode, and when I saw the portrayal of David Koresh, I was like, no, that's he wasn't like that. That guy's way too nice. That guy's way too polite and nice to people. No, he was pretty hard. He was a hard taskmaster. I would say 50% at least. Maybe 50% of the time he could be somewhat nice, but on the other 50%, he's going to really stay on your ass and and try to get you in shape and keep you in line. And he certainly isn't going to tolerate any back talk or any kind of doubt, or so he could be pretty rough. I mean, the scream tape that I mentioned earlier, there's a section on there where he really lets loose and he's pretty angry, and that is an example of his wrath. So and then there's other talk in the tape where he's speaking very harshly about his detractors and going to do really horrible things, and so
a question I didn't ask you before, just you've heard him give a sermon. I've heard one myself. And a very good orator, certainly sounds very convincing, and knew the scripture that he was quoting. What was it actually like? I mean, we hear stories in the UK of 8-9 hour sermons. Is that true?
Yeah, there's sometimes. I would say maybe once every month or two, you could have a fairly long sermon like that. A typical sermon would be at least 4 hours.
Wow.
That was average. So sometimes you would go all day, an 8-hour day. Sure. That was not crazy. You could have those. Sometimes you'd have an all-nighter. I did that once.
No way.
He would have an all-nighter occasionally, but it wasn't required. But I did it because for those that were really interested in really learning, I was like, okay, let's just do one of these all-nighters and see what happens. Boy, it's you're all night long.
Could you get up and leave? I mean, did you have to sit and listen? Did he take it as an offense if you got up and walked out? Could you go to the toilet?
I used to walk out of his studies all the time because I'd get bored and I'd go watch the evening news. I was a bad boy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was rebellious. I'll admit it.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, it's interesting. Fascinating.
Now, when I was there, that would have been 89. So maybe a few years later, maybe getting up and leaving, that might have been not something that there was happening much more. So I'm not sure, but yeah.
And just a final thing, just describe WACO as a place. The compound. What kind of place was it? On the photographs and on the footage that I've seen, it always seemed like a very fun place to be, a peaceful place, a tranquil place. It looks a nice place to be.
So this is Central Texas, East Texas, actually more. And it is, I went to visit there in 1996. When I went there wasn't anybody around for some reason. People that were off in town or whatever. And me and my wife walked around the area. It was very peaceful, very tranquil. It seemed like a wildlife preserve, like so many birds and snakes and turtles. And there was a pool, for example, that was being dug. I don't know if you've seen that pool back there in some pictures.
Yeah, I have.
So that pool was still there, and there was still water in it, and I think there might have been some turtles in there or something, and snakes. It could be very nice in the springtime, and the fall, when it's not too cold and not too hot. It's a very desirable location in terms of being out in the rural area. And I actually spent a lot of time at Mount Carmel when I was younger and back in '84, and I liked it. It was a nice place. Sure. Certainly a desirable location. I can see why Koresh wanted the property back. Certainly a nice place to live. So.
And you mentioned somebody owns it now. Who owns the estate now?
Yeah. So Charles Pace, who was also a member under Lois Roden, was able to legally acquire the property through some kind of legal maneuver in Texas. I don't know the details, but he fulfilled certain legal requirements in terms of, might have something to do with establishing residency for a certain number of years, and maybe paying some taxes or whatever. And so after a legal process, he acquired the title to the property. So he's in charge now. So he's one of those factions that was in disagreement with Vernon back in the day, in the '84 that I told you about. He was an alternate faction. So now he's the last man standing. Like I said, he's the one there. I don't think he has a very large group, but he has some that are following him. Yeah.
Do you think we'll ever see something like this happen again?
Not Not out of there, probably not. No. And as far as the government, probably because maybe they've learned something now. I don't know if they would do the same thing because of just the fear of getting involved, and they might take another tactic, right? They might be more patient and wait longer or something. I don't know. Yeah,
I've got to be. I look at the videos and the the documentaries. The documentary that was filmed, the interviews that David did when he was up at Mount Carmel. There's a hint of narcissism about him for me. Somebody who loved the publicity, loved the media, was a little bit of a failure at things that he'd done, and he'd found something that he was good at, which was manipulating people into doing things that he wanted to do in a particular way. And for me, that is my view on Vernon Howell, aka David Koresh. So I just want to plug this book a little bit because before we're finished, Koresh, the true story of David Koresh and the tragedy at Waco. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with this book, and tell us what this book tells us that other books don't.
That book, the author contacted me in around 2020, sometime after the pandemic. His goal was to try to give an origin story, because obviously, like most of us, your early life is not written down or documented somewhere. So when Koresh is toward the end of his life, all of this stuff is happening, and standoffs and sieges. And if you want to know early details of childhood or whatever, it's hard to find those. This author went and interviewed me, and then of course other people who knew him when he was younger, including a former girlfriend. And so there's a lot of information in this book about the early life of David Koresh that maybe hadn't been so well known or known at all. And so that's the thing that the book does, is kind of gives you more details, and you might give you some insight as to why he turned out the way that he did.
Yeah.
If you read it. So, and then of course it goes into later in the book, it'll go into more well-known areas. But the interesting to me in the book is of all of the little known or unknown information concerning his early life that would be very interesting to some people.
Fascinating. Well, maybe we could get Stefan on the show if he's up for it. It would be nice.
You might want to try to get a hold of him and see if he wants to talk about it. Yeah.
Nice to get him on. Other books I will recommend whilst I'm here. This book by David Thibodeau was absolutely fantastic. I've got to speak to David on a couple of occasions, and the guy's a really nice guy. And honestly, this book, which was dramatized, of course.
So David Thibodeau was somebody who was coming in as I was going out. So he's kind of the other half of the story. I wasn't there when David was there. So he's got something to say for sure.
Fascinating book, though. It's a fascinating book. And this one, if you want to, don't say I don't give a balanced promotion on this show. This one, Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. Again, it's a very good read. And it gives you it from the other side of things. And Gary seemed to be one of the good guys. I've got to be perfectly honest. He was a negotiator. He was trying his best. He was doing his job.
Sure, right.
And,
you're a government employee trying to help not prevent violence. I mean, what are you going to do? You got to do your best.
It's just a pity the guy wasn't, capable of staying on the phone for all the time. The fact that they had to swap, I think, created the paranoia, which again didn't help the situation. But
right.
Yeah, we could talk all night, David. Honestly, thank you so much for coming on.
No problem.
I'm looking forward really to. I know you've sent me quite a bit of reading material.
Yeah,
I'm going to have a good read and a good listen of various things. Is there anything you would like to promote before we call an end today?
No, that's good. The book is the main thing I wanted to discuss. So you plug that. So we're good.
Well, you get that on Amazon in the UK. It is a fascinating read. Make sure you get a copy of that. And I'll chase up Stefan and hopefully get him on. And if there's anybody else from the Branch Davidian community who'd like to come on and do a podcast, I'll be only too happy to give anybody an opportunity to come on and tell their story, have their say. If you want to leave a comment about what David and I have discussed tonight, stick a comment below. That would be fantastic. And David, thank you so much for your time. And it'll be coming up to lunchtime in the USA now. So
sure.
You have a good day, and let's keep in touch with it. And Douglas Stockwell, thank you for that. He says, thanks, David. You rocked it, buddy.
Right.
Great stuff, mate. Take care. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay as you go waste collection. Thanks also to Mr. Vicky's, handmade in Cumbria. These sauces are really hot stuff. You can order them by emailing info@mrvickys.co.uk or by telephoning 01768 210 102. Thanks to Neil and the guys at Media Arts for all the help with the video side of things. And thanks to qtechshop.co.uk, the makers of pool tables and snooker tables in Wallsend, Newcastle, and the guys who run our website, nufcmatters.com. If you want to subscribe to the show, hit the subscribe button tonight. It is free. Hit the thumb up under the video to like the video and click share to share to your other social media. If you want to join the channel, hit join. There's 3 different tiers. Pick the one that suits you and help support the channel financially. If you want to pay a one-off membership fee of £25 and get these goodies, a scarf, a pen, a cup, and entry into the monthly draw, then go to NUFC Matters and look for membership pack. Failing that, get your smartphone and put it over the QR code and it will take you straight there. We're also a podcast and you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and other podcast providers. Usually goes up 24 hours after the show has finished. We also support the food bank on this channel. If you want to make a virtual donation today at the Matchday Bucket, go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and you can make a deposit today. Don't forget to enter the Shearer raffle. There's 150 tickets, £1 per ticket, and you can win a limited edition signed Alan Shearer ball. Enter now at nufcmatters.com. If you have a look on our website, we've also got a vast range of mugs, t-shirts, cups, and whatever else takes your fancy. The Isaac t-shirt is proven popular this month, $16.99 plus delivery from nufcmatters.com. Don't forget as well, we do a range of events over the course of the year. We have Peter Beardsley, an up-close and personal evening at the Tynemouth Surf Cafe. Limited tickets remain, 25th of April. Get them now from Surf Cafe, tynemouth.co.uk or from ticketweb.uk. There's also an evening with Peter Beardsley on May the 19th at the Tyneside Irish Centre, and you can get tickets from newcastlelegends.com, and tickets are £50. Don't forget our end of season do takes place 27th of May, 7 o'clock at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets for that one are a tenner. nufcmatters.com is where you can get your tickets for that. In June, Thursday the 1st of June to be precise, Rob Lee will be at Louis Liquor Store in the Big Market in Newcastle, and tickets for that are available direct from the venue. And an evening with Rob Lee, Lee Clark and John Beresford takes place the next evening on Friday the 2nd of June at the Grand Hotel in Gosforth. This is a charity event and tables are of £10, £700, and you can book them by contacting Natalie at heelandtour.org.uk or visiting their website. In July, Gavin Peacock is in Newcastle on July the 10th at the Tyneside Irish Centre. Tickets for that are available from nufcmatters.com. And he also takes an evening with at the Surf Cafe in Tynemouth on the 11th of July. So get your tickets direct from the venue for that one as well. And if you're a boxing fan, the Night of Champions, Ricky Hatton, Frank Bruno, Nigel Benn and Joe Calzaghe takes place at the Fed. And that will be taking place on the 16th of June. More dates to be added. Tickets from all those events, www.goldstarpromotions.co.uk.